Okay, I want to step back a little bit. Earlier you spoke about your experience in the private sector. Many small businesses argue that a major part of the issue they face outside of raising capital is actually having access to a steady supply of projects and work for their businesses. What are your views on the government opening the market space, possibly by privatizing some areas of government operations to provide more jobs for small businesses?
Okay, well, I'll back up a bit before I answer that question. And I'm putting on my private sector hat now since you put me there. But essentially, I think before somebody decides to go into business, you have to sit down carefully and decide, honestly, and ask yourself, do I have what it takes to run a business? That's the first thing. Number two, the kind of business that I want to run, is it needed by the St. Kitts and Nevis market? That's the next question. And then the third question is, if it is needed and I have what it takes to run a business, can I expect that the goods and services that I expect to sell through this business are available locally? By extension, could I expect to find the staff that I need to run this business locally? Okay? Do I have the kinds of skills that I could put into this business? Next question. Are you the type of individual, and when you do your audit about whether or not you have what it takes to run a business, you should be also asking, are you also acknowledging that most small businesses take about 5 years to turn a profit the first time, and that you might find yourself going through a situation where you can't pay yourself a salary during that time because you have to make a decision to pay the light bill, to pay the government their unincorporated business tax by the 15th of each month, and then your exemptions might be smaller, it might be larger, depending on whether you're selling goods or services. If you're selling goods, then your government exemption is higher because they expect that a considerable portion of your income will go into replenishment of stock. When it comes to service providers, of course your exemptions are much lower because they expect that most of the work that you put into your business is creative power, so that your startup cost should be less. So these are some of the questions that I think we need to answer first. The second thing is the infrastructure, the market that you're operating in. I mentioned earlier about the legislative infrastructure for getting into business in terms of the Small Business Development Act. That act, and I would admonish any private sector person, especially a small business person, to go to government headquarters and get a copy of that. You probably have to pay a nominal fee to get it, but it is there. And it tells you those businesses that are entitled to receive fiscal incentives. By that I mean whether or not you would qualify to receive concessions like duty-free in terms of bringing in a vehicle, your equipment, your raw materials, like if you decided to start a manufacturing outfit, so that you know exactly what is allowed for you. One of the other areas we hope that eventually the legislation will be able to give us is concessionary rates for financing, for business financing. But that is going to be a hard sell because generally your standard commercial banks are not in the habit of lending money to start-up businesses, especially those types of businesses that are considered novelty businesses, where you don't have a tried and true track record that say they're going to make money, because remember, it's other people's money you're asking the bank to lend you. And the bank has to be sure that at the end of the month you could pay back that loan because it's other people's money they took to lend you. So if it's an experimental business, you're talking more about the area of venture capital. We do not have any venture capital firms as yet in St. Kitts and Nevis, and that calls for perhaps to start it, maybe a group of business persons who have already made it, to come together and find a pool of funds that you can put in, and then have business persons come to you with their business plan and tell you, making a case, why should I lend you money? So it's about the local version of Shark Tank. Okay? So, but then my thing is, if it's the approach like Shark Tank on television, you shouldn't have a problem with that. Because if you are so in love with your business idea, that you are so sure in your gut that it is going to work, you shouldn't be afraid to tell people what you want to do and what your business vision is. You should be able to go in there and talk the talk about what you think that business can do, so that the venture capitalists would be able to write a check for you, because they want back their money to it when it's over. And at the end of it, they also might want to share in your business, which is another consideration, because some of us want people to spend money in your business, but they don't want to acknowledge that by you having a share in this person's business, by investing in it, maybe I'm entitled to 50% of your shares, and you tell yourself, Natty, when is me alone busting my tail in here? Well, no, you can't have your cake and eat it. So the other approach now, in terms of opportunities for privatization of certain government services, for the government, and by specific terms, I mean this team unity government, for us to make a decision about privatization, I think what you really mean is outsourcing. Like outsourcing certain government services. For that to happen, the government will have to be certain that the outsourcing of certain government functions and services will be better served by putting it in private sector hands. So that is the key determinant. Will it be better served by putting it in private sector hands? Because you can't just get up without thinking of the pros and cons and the consequences and say, well, I don't think government should continue. Let's say, for example, government procurement. Things like the CPU, Central Purchasing Unit, or another function in government. It could be like privatizing your ambulance service. When we've done that, what does this mean? Does this mean that private citizens who in the past could call and get an ambulance to come and take up a sick person and you don't pay a cent for it, that when you privatize this, you expect that the same ambulance is going to come for you and you don't pay for it? Of course not. You have to pay for it because it's a private sector entity now. So it's about the cost that would accrue to the public if those services were privatized. That, I think, is the biggest determinant. And I think most governments, as they graduate, the US has done it, a lot of the G7 countries like the UK and others, and even in some larger CARICOM territories, they may outsource certain services because it is more economical for them to deal with that, to get rid of the burden of having to manage those services, but they would not make those decisions without carefully thinking of the consequences, because at the end of the day, what you don't want is to have government programs and services privatized to the point where they're out of reach of the normal man or woman who otherwise, before privatization, took it for granted that government was providing that for him or her. So I think that would be the biggest determinant.